The JFK conspiracy is the biggest conspiracy in history. The consequences of President Kennedy's assassination resound even to today. Was it the work of one crazed lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, or were there others who knew about the assassination before it took place? Tonight, it's the President John Kennedy assassination. Oh, and by the way, all the rumors you have ever heard about the assassination are true. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Good evening, folks. I would like to welcome Larry Hancock back for the second time in as many weeks. Larry, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Brent.
Hi, Larry. Welcome back to the show.
It's good to be here. And by the way, the theme song makes up for it all anyway.
Oh, you're very kind, my friend. You're very kind. That was triple stack Marshalls, I'll have you know. And I leaped off them in pure Pete Townsend form from The Who. For you younger guys, The Who. Let's get into it right away. Let's talk about Jack Ruby. Just let me tell the folks, we are indeed speaking with Larry Hancock tonight, and Larry Hancock is a researcher. He has researched who knew about the assassination before the assassination. He's got an incredible book out called Someone Would Have Talked, and the book is available at JFKlancer.com, www.jfklancer.com. Also, JFK Lancer, I must thank them again for helping me put these series of shows together this month. They have been crucial in getting me the terrific guests. For example, this afternoon we had Abraham Bolden on. Last week we had Sherry Feaster. And Larry is part of that group. And he will also be speaking at a conference, an annual JFK conference that JFK Lancer puts on every year in Dallas, Texas, where the assassination took place. And for any information about that you would like to have, please go to jfklancer.com. Jack Ruby, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the assassination took place November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. The reputed assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be the lone gunman shooting from behind JFK. He was supposed to have gotten 3 shots off in something like 6.5 seconds from a bolt-action rifle. Now, any of you hunters out there know for sure that that's an impossibility. So right away, that would raise red flags. 2 days later, on the Sunday at 11 o'clock in the morning, Dallas time, Jack Ruby, a known mafioso, in front of 70 police officers as Oswald was being transferred from the jail to the county courthouse, I believe, was shot dead right in front of everybody, live TV in those days. And we're going to discuss Jack Ruby's role and who he was and where he came from and his associations tonight with Larry Hancock. Larry, welcome to the show again.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on and saving my tuchus tonight. Thank you.
You're certainly welcome. Where do we start?
Let's start with Jack Ruby, and let's just jump right in. Let's start maybe on the Thursday night before the assassination, which took place on the Friday.
Well, I think one important thing, just to establish a benchmark, is you talk in your introduction about people that knew in advance that something was going to happen.
Yes, sir.
And Jack probably qualifies as one of those. When Congress was reinvestigating the assassination in the 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations took a statement from an individual. Actually, it was forwarded to them by the Internal Revenue Service, and the IRS told them that they had had a long time informant in Dallas who was a good friend of Ruby's and close to him. And it was particularly important because he had told them and given them a statement that before the assassination, Ruby had come to him and asked him if he wanted to go downtown on during the motorcade to, quote-unquote, watch all the fireworks. The fellow passed it up, but it would suggest that Jack had some early knowledge that something special was going to happen during the motorcade. Possibly not that the president was going to be killed, but certainly that something was going to happen.
Also on the Thursday night, did he not have a meeting at a motel that was owned by Marcello or Roselli, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, he did. He had dinner. He had a meeting. As you said, all of the spots that Jack frequented were known, perhaps not say mafia, but known crime hangouts. Campisi's, the restaurant that he dined at that evening, was frequented by mob folks in Dallas, and it was Jack just circulated in that milieu. It's interesting the fact that everyone except the FBI and the Warren Commission clearly understood that Jack was connected to people within organized crime. So yes, he did have meetings. He saw people that evening that were from that environment. He had been in contact with a number of people in the 2 weeks preceding who were from that same environment. People from Chicago, people from Los Angeles. And it's sort of fascinating. Jack has created a great number of problems for the Warren Commission, or he would have created a great number of problems for the Warren Commission, except for the fact that the FBI gave them a report that said that they had interviewed some of his old associates who had absolutely told them that he really did not have any mob connections. The only problem with that are the two sources that they cite as clearing them are both extremely well-connected mob people. So that sort of the FBI and the Warren Commission really had to do a lot of work to ignore some of Jack's connections, and which they did. And just to give another insight into that, the Warren Commission actually had very few of its own field investigators. It depended almost entirely on the FBI. And as a matter of fact, the commissioners knew that they were pretty much at the mercy of the FBI's report. But they did have two people who they sent down to Dallas. And those people became very suspicious of Jack Ruby and his connections, and were very much focused on Ruby, and they were actually removed from the investigation and ousted from the Warren Commission's staff. However, they did agree to resign, but one of the terms of the resignation was that they wanted to be called back when the Warren Commission eventually did interview Ruby. I mean, strangely enough, the Warren Commission waited months to interview Ruby. And so they obtained a formal commitment that they would be able to come back, and when he testified, which he did under polygraph, that they would be involved. And as you might guess, they weren't. So the only two people that knew about Ruby in depth that could have assisted the Warren Commission weren't even present at the time that his statements were taken.
Can we trace Ruby's steps after the assassination on that Friday afternoon? I know there are some witnesses that try and put him not only on the Grassy Knoll, running along the Grassy Knoll, but also try to put him in the Texas Theater where Oswald was eventually picked up.
Well, we can trace them pretty precisely. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that I attempt to do in my book, simply because by doing that, you see Ruby's behavior change pretty dramatically over a short time. It's clear that about the time, or shortly after the time of the assassination, he was in newspaper offices. His alibi was that he was at the newspaper office throughout the assassination that he had not gone to see the president, that he had not gone to see the motorcade. And he was reported by people to the newspaper office. It appears that that was probably an alibi, and the newspaper offices were just a block or so off the route, so it would have been easy to move back and forth. But I think that's kind of the starting point. Just to set the context of that, it's sort of interesting because eventually he would tell the jury in his trial for killing Lee Oswald that he was so emotionally committed to the president and so sympathetic towards Jackie that he actually killed Oswald so that Jackie wouldn't have to come back for trial.
Yeah, that was his excuse.
Now, two problems with that. First of all, it really is hard to visualize that kind of commitment to the president if he didn't even take the trouble to go watch the motorcade and see him.
Mm-hmm.
So, that sort of undermines it. What even undermines it more is that one of his lawyers was told by Ruby himself that alibi was something that his first lawyer gave him to use.
Oh.
So we can just throw that one away. But sometimes you need that kind of context to get an insight into him. So we'll get to that later, I'm sure. But it's very unlikely that his stated reason for killing Lee Oswald was the truth.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like such a far-fetched excuse, a spur-on-the-moment thing, especially coming from a character such as Jack Ruby, that it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Never known for having a lot of interest in politics or national affairs or anything like that, no, or Jack Kennedy for that matter. But so we start out there, and I think several things happen in the first hour or so after the assassination. One of the things we know is that a series of calls started coming into Jack's club, the Carousel Club, for him. And just the man making the calls was described as pretty frantic, wanting to get in touch with Jack very badly. And when the fellow taking the phone messages told Ruby about him, Ruby made it very clear to him that he was supposed to forget those calls were coming in, and as a matter of fact, that guy ended up hitchhiking out of Dallas the next morning, obviously sensing that there were things he'd rather not talk about if it came to that, or the morning after Ruby killed Oswald.
Oswald, the Monday morning, okay.
That's right. So we've got calls coming in for Jack immediately after the assassination. What we hear next is that Jack was reported, and I think very reliably, at Parkland Hospital, where the president had been taken. And he was seen by a couple of people, one man who knew him well, who spoke with him, and he actually asked this reporter, Seth Cantor, about the president's condition, and it seemed like Ruby was very concerned about what the president's condition was. And Cantor would offer that testimony to the Warren Commission, who decided just literally to ignore him on that fact. And again, kind of amazing because it was clear that he did know Ruby, and there's no reason he would have made that up. And Cantor went on to do an excellent investigation of Ruby and write that up because after his own experience, he knew there was something fishy, obviously. So we have Jack probably in the area of the motorcade. We have Jack at the newspaper office. We have Jack rushing out to Parkland Hospital rather than going back to his club, as a matter of fact, and then eventually getting back to his club.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
I just want to tell folks that are unfamiliar again with the assassination that Parkland Hospital was the hospital that President Kennedy was rushed to. It was about 3 to 5 kilometers from Dealey Plaza. Unfortunately, the doctors there could not resuscitate him because half his head was blown off. Rumor has it that, as Larry Hancock has just told us, Jack Ruby was there. He was seen. He's physically witnessed. And speculation has it, I should say, that he planted the magic bullet at Parkland Hospital. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
I mean, that has been common speculation. As for myself, it's possible that that bullet is quite mysterious. There are a lot of mysteries about the bullet, including the fact that two of the men who found it and handled it now say that the bullet in evidence officially isn't the bullet they found.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, they've both been interviewed. I've seen one of them on video, and he's quite clear that the bullet that he found and handled was a sharp-nosed hunting-type bullet and not the blunt-nosed full metal jacketed bullet, which was entered into evidence as the E399.
Okay, let's go back to Jack Ruby's whereabouts. I didn't mean to get off track there. I was just trying to clarify things for the novice listener, and it looks like I've just created another Dallas in Wonderland hole for them.
Easy to do.
Oh, man. It's so, I was going to say complex, but in a sense it is not complex. It is simplicity into of itself, but it is very convoluted because there is a lot of things that intertwine with each other in the assassination, and the more you get into it, there are certain connections that are being made over from the left to the right and the center, and it's amazing how all the pieces start to come together. But without further ado, back to Mr. Hancock and back to the tracing of Jack Ruby's whereabouts that day.
Well, the next time we find him, he does make it back to the club after Parkland, and he knows that somebody has been calling him, and he makes a couple of telephone calls. He really, as I recollect, didn't make a lot of telephone calls. The two significant calls he made that afternoon were to call his sister, and then he called an acquaintance of his in Los Angeles named Gruber, who actually had come by to visit Jack a couple of weeks prior to the assassination. Jack had not seen the man for over 10 years. They weren't really close. It just someone out of his past in Chicago, and the reason he shows up in Dallas has generated a lot of speculation, because when the Warren Commission interviewed him and asked him, well, why would it be that after all those years you just decided to visit Jack Ruby? Well, what caused that? And his answer was that he had been right next door, and he was so close that it was, he just felt that he had to see Jack. The strange thing about that is he had been in Little Rock, Arkansas. And for those of you familiar with our geography, that's not exactly right next door to Dallas.
No, that would be like Montreal, Toronto, actually.
So that, again, that didn't really ring too true. But he is the man that Jack calls that afternoon and talks to for a few minutes, and we don't know that that's the person that was trying to get in touch with him so desperately, but he calls him and talks with him. And again, when asked what they were talking about, Jack simply said that he wanted to chat with him, among other things, about the fact that the fellow might be taking one of his dogs. So again, Jack Ruby, who we're supposed to view as, terribly upset by the attack on the president, is calling someone he's met once in 12 years in California to talk to him about a dog.
Seems like a load of untruthness.
It sort of strains the imagination.
Any speculation on what you believe he told him?
I think that the person might well have been a liaison to Jack from... I think it's pretty clear that Jack was signed up to play some sort of a support role, probably not a primary role in the assassination. Courier. Jack was very valuable to the people that put together the organization, because they needed someone local. They needed someone with connections into the police force. They needed someone who could probably find out about who was assigned to what. If they needed a policeman who might be willing to do certain actions for money, Jack would know who it was. Jack was extremely well positioned into certain elements of the police force, even though the head of the police force refused to acknowledge that. That is a well-documented fact. So he would have been quite a local asset for someone, but as I say, probably no primary role, and perhaps not even an exact idea of what was supposed to happen. The reason I say that is that shortly after he made that telephone call to California, he showed up at his sister's house, and his sister, in effect, described him as being a broken man. And described the fact that shortly after he showed up, he went into the bathroom and threw up.
Oh, man. So something obviously happened.
Doesn't relate too well to, calling a man about a dog. So my speculation is that Jack, who had thought he was doing a series of fairly minor jobs that would really ingratiate him with some of the well-known names in certain areas of gambling and crime, suddenly was told that he had a new job to do, and that he was going to be necessary for him to get in touch with Lee Oswald and kill him.
That makes perfect sense to me. Folks, we are speaking with JFK renowned researcher Larry Hancock. Larry Hancock's book, Someone Would Have Talked, can be got through the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com. And we're speaking tonight about Jack Ruby, who was the assassin who supposedly killed the president's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. We're tracing his steps right through that weekend up to the point where he killed Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days later after the assassin. Larry, do you feel that Jack Ruby was being run by the mob, or maybe somebody above the mob?
Oh, I think Ruby's stock in trade was doing favors for people. I mean, I don't. He certainly was not an integral part of any crime network. He wanted to be, and the people he admired and the people he considered to be the real, the guys that he would like to be in a position of would be major gamblers in Vegas, major gamblers in Havana. He had had a friend who had worked in a casino in Havana. And he had gone down to visit him, and probably have done a courier job there. That's another story. But so to answer your question, he's not a made mafioso. He's not any kind of a mob boss. He is not a soldier, as it were. But he's part of that crowd, and he knows the right people. He does favors for people when he can, and he gets favors when he can. I think it says a lot that when he was put in jail in Dallas, one of his first visitors was the second-ranking mob guy in Dallas. And it's kind of interesting that didn't seem to draw much attention, but it's pretty clear that the man visited him just to reinforce what the accepted behavior was and was not going to be. In fact, he didn't even have to say anything to Ruby. It would be just show up, and Ruby knows that he either keeps his mouth shut or friends and family start to disappear.
That's a very good point. That's great research, Larry, by the way. That's terrific. You're educating me some more tonight. Let's go on to, let's just continue with it and talk about what happened during that evening, Friday evening.
Well, the next thing we see, and this indicates this is one of the dramatic changes in behaviors that started giving you an insight. So, the last time we see Ruby, he goes through this experience at his sister's, and obviously is in a fairly traumatic state. And then the next time we really see him is he is at the police station, and he is starting to escort. Well, first of all, we have a statement from a policeman who the Warren Commission chose to ignore again, that he was actually reported trying to enter the room where Oswald was being interrogated.
Now, why would he want to do that?
Beats me, sheer coincidence. I'm probably looking for men's room or something.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
But then he starts, and because everybody knows him, and one of his problems at this point is that there's so many police that do know Jack Ruby and would ask the same question that he was asked when he was trying to get in the door, which is essentially, Jack, what are you doing? So what he does is he adopts a reporter's pose, and he picks up some foreign newsmen are starting to come in, and he starts going through the police building with these foreign newsmen as if he's assisting them. And he circulates around police headquarters that evening and actually gets into, by midnight, gets into the press conference where Oswald is brought in and shown to the reporters. And there's a photograph of Ruby, and this is the Jack Ruby who is now wearing glasses and and holding a notepad and pencil, or pen, as if he is a reporter, fitting in, blending in. And when, at one point during the press conference, a remark is made by the police that Oswald was a member of a certain Cuban organization, Jack Ruby from the rear of the room pipes up and says, "No, that's really," and states the actual name of the organization.
The Fair Play for Cuba.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, and where would Jack have heard this? But, you know, and bringing himself to the attention of Oswald. You know, so obviously one can speculate at this point in time is Jack is, first of all, wanting to see if, you know, Oswald is talking or appears to be talking about anything. And the interesting thing is, after the press conference, the people who run into Jack report him as being in absolutely a hyper state, just extremely happy, cheerful, smiling. And, you know, again, you can speculate that the good news is he thinks Oswald is not talking, and even better, if Oswald knows him, he hasn't said anything.
Now, Larry, there is speculation, too, that indeed Ruby and Oswald knew each other. I was just wondering how you felt about that.
I think that there's probably a good likelihood that they did, at least casually. I have to think that some of the minor assignments that Ruby was given would have related to a knowledge that Oswald was there. Now, whether Oswald was actually in the club has been reported. I still do think that's a possibility, because at that point in time, neither man would have realized that they were at any particular risk, because Ruby's role was very minor. And as I say, I don't think he really knew that there was going to be a murder of a president. If he had, he would have been a lot more cautious about certain things. I don't think he would have invited his friend down to see the fireworks.
Very good point. Very good point.
The same thing goes for Oswald. You know, neither of these new men were aware of exactly what was going to happen, or the import of what was going to happen. So there would have been no reason that they might not have been casually associating. And actually, as I write in the book, there are a number of things that suggest that part of the plot may well have been to link the two men together, and to link both of them as being paid by Fidel Castro. And there are a variety of leads that do point towards Ruby as being in the pay of Castro. And both men may have been targeted as being unknowing patsies. Of course, after Oswald was taken into custody, Ruby's role would change dramatically.
Big time. Big time.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
So back to Friday night, and he's at the press conference. He corrects a reporter with the Fair Play for Cuba committee name that the reporter had got wrong. What happens after that?
He's up all night. He's contacting various people, talking to various people. He's taking sandwiches, or trying to take sandwiches to the police. Basically,
I always thought that was bizarre. The sandwich thing? It's Jack, right? It's Jack Ruby.
It's Jack, yes it is.
I know, I'll bring them sandwiches, yeah, okay.
So, you know, he's circulating. I guess that the best way you could describe it, he's circulating among everyone that he can think of that, A, might pass on information if Oswald does begin to talk, and B, who may provide information about what's happening with Oswald. Now, during that night, and I think this can't be entirely verified, but we do know that there were a series of calls made to the police, the FBI. The caller told them that Oswald was going to be attacked and killed during the transfer from the police department to the sheriff's department.
Sheriff's department. I got that one wrong. Yeah.
Later on, there's no doubt about these calls. Later on, the officer actually taking the call after Ruby shot Oswald would come to say that he didn't realize it by the time, but he also knew Jack Ruby. So many people did, that he felt that the person who had called with a warning was indeed Jack Ruby. And the speculation on that point was that Ruby was doing anything that he could think of to get out of his assignment.
That makes perfect sense.
Or not to get out of his assignment,
no, but I know what you mean.
Stop from fulfilling it, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And obviously, if the officer is correct and it was Ruby calling, I can't think of any other interpretation to put on it. But the next day we see Ruby back around the police. He was circulating so much around police headquarters and around the school book department in the area down there that the news crews and Cantor, all this work comes from Cantor's research, because Cantor got to be fascinated with it. He interviewed all these people, and he just got to be so familiar that they actually designated him. They didn't know who they were, but he kept showing up. He actually came by one of the news crews and got one of their boxes of food, lunch boxes, and they all recognized him. And when the shooting occurred on TV, as you described earlier, they knew him. They had seen him continuously the day before. And interestingly, at one point, a police officer stopped Jack and said, "Jack, why are you hanging around here so much?" And Jack says, "Well, because they're going to transfer Oswald. This is Saturday afternoon." And the amazing thing is, that was the plan. They were preparing to transfer him. It didn't come off for a variety of reasons, but it appears that Jack was well enough connected to know that there was a transfer that was being worked out on Saturday afternoon, and it got postponed.
Would you characterize Jack as stalking Oswald?
Oh, I would have to say you would characterize him as stalking Oswald.
Okay.
Which totally, his whole point about the whole shooting being impromptu and spontaneous, he just happened to have his gun with him, he just happened to be standing in the police basement. It just makes no sense at all when you look at his detailed behavior from the previous 48 hours. He had obviously been stalking, and of course he lied about all of it, and until they caught him and said, "Jack, we know you." He denied virtually everything until he was caught in a lie, and then he just kind of, accept it. But the funny thing is that the Warren Commission accepted Ruby's statements about his activities and rejected the police officers and other people that gave the descriptions that I've just related to you.
Okay.
Which is sort of fascinating as to why you would believe Ruby about his own activities.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
But we run into that occasionally in this conspiracy stuff. It's sort of like you get a lone nut and killer, and then suddenly everybody believes what they say.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It defies all logic in so many areas, this assassination, and the witnesses who are ignored and the witnesses who are taken verbatim for what they say and have no credibility whatsoever.
Well, it's a lot. It makes things go a lot faster if you do that. It'd really slow you down getting your verdict if you.
You would actually have to investigate.
But so that kind of leads us up. I mean, that's basically the whole pattern of his behavior prior to shooting Oswald is stalking, as you say. He's constantly focused on Oswald. He's in areas around Oswald. He's in areas around where the police are, and that's the picture of his behavior. And I think it's then fascinating that even the police, again, after the shooting, when he's taken upstairs and taken into custody, the officers themselves described his actions as relief.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you about that. How was,
and
yeah.
he asked the officer who's taken into custody, and I think this is great. One of his first remarks is, "Don't you think I'd make a great actor?"
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I think you would, Jack.
I think you are.
Yeah.
You know?
You're doing fine.
And he inquired constantly about Oswald's condition, actually. Didn't he also?
Oh, yes, absolutely he did. So, that's just, as far as Ruby goes, I find it almost impossible when you go through that series of activities that he did not have some prior knowledge, that there was not some association, and that he had a task that got changed in midstream and he had no choice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, later on during his court trial, and this gets very extended, I mean, certainly when the Warren Commission finally got around to interviewing him and interviewing him under polygraph, he told Chief Justice Warren that the only way he could conceivably talk is for them to take him out of Dallas, take him to Washington, D.C., and put him into some very secure situation where he would be able to talk. And Warren said, "Well, I'm sorry, we can't do that." Okay. Mm-hmm. Jack, being a bright guy, would probably know that at that point in time, he just as well keep his mouth shut. You can sort of sense what people want to know and what they don't want to know.
Was there not a reporter that asked Jack Ruby, also, if... what did the reporter ask him, essentially? I'm going to paraphrase. Well, okay, go ahead. You probably know what I'm going to ask you.
I've talked to the reporter that was there when that question... at one point, Ruby was being taken down a hallway, and basically the reporters yelled out, mm-hmm. or were asking him what had really happened and what was really going on. And,
was it a conspiracy? Yeah.
It was, and his answer was that certainly that there was something going on, and if they really wanted to find out what was behind it, they would have to go right to the top, to Washington. And I asked the reporter, and he said it was pretty clearly thought among the group that he was suggesting that Johnson was involved.
Isn't that incredible? And nobody followed up on it.
No, nobody really followed up on it. But I mean, by that time, the Warren Commission was so well on its way, mm-hmm. That, and obviously they weren't interested in Ruby, because you would have thought that he would have been one of the very first to interview, but they waited until they waited for months to talk to him. So, no, there was not a lot. There was a lot more interested in voiding Mr. Ruby than in talking to Mr. Ruby.
What eventually happened to Jack Ruby?
Jack was convicted. Jack spent, to my understanding, Jack spent a great amount of his time in jail, actually in a cell right there on the east side of Dealey Plaza, with a view down into the plaza. What finally eventually happening, though, is that his sentence was overturned. And I think that's mm-hmm. interesting because his sentence was overturned. He was granted a new trial. He was going to be tried. I think his sentence was overturned, and a new trial was scheduled in January, and he was supposed to go on trial in the first part of the year in Wichita Falls, Texas. And shortly after that verdict was issued, he was diagnosed with cancer mm-hmm. and died within a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it was pancreatic cancer, if I'm not mistaken. Right. There was also speculation that perhaps he was injected with cancer cells. How do you feel about that one?
Well, Ruby himself apparently thought that. That one is one that just escapes me. I'm certain that no one involved in the conspiracy would have wanted him to go to trial again. But the injecting with cancer cells, I guess the point is Ruby had not had a great health history anyway. Mm-hmm. It's not. I think the reason that's caused a lot of speculation is that he had been, in jail and in custody and getting routine medical checks, and nobody had found anything wrong with him. But I think we all know by now that cancer can show up pretty rapidly.
Yes, especially pancreatic.
I don't necessarily view that as being terribly strange, considering what he'd been through. I just don't know that we could know.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
We are speaking with JFK researcher Larry Hancock, and Larry Hancock has a terrific book out, folks. I urge you all to go and get it. It is called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals specifically about people, as Jack Ruby was, a person who knew about the assassination before it happened. You can go to the JFK Lancer website, which is JFK, Lancer, LANCER.com website, and order the book. Also at the JFK Lancer website, if you're interested in this subject matter, it's a terrific resource. And they also have a newsletter, an email newsletter that comes out, I think it's weekly actually. It's just an incredible resource of information about the assassination. They've really done a dynamite job. I have to give Deborah Conway kudos because her website is just phenomenal. And I know you're involved directly with that too, Larry, as well as others such as Sherry Feaster. Just incredible. They also have a terrific conference every year. They've been putting it on for about 21 years now. You can get information about that conference also at the website, jfklancer.com. The conference Larry will be speaking at, he's got new research coming out, and he'll be talking about that. The conference takes place in Dallas on the 21st to the 23rd of this November. Go to the website, check it out. There's a forum there and everything. There's so much information there. I hesitate to go on further about it. I just encourage all of you to question everything and find out what you can about this Dallas in Wonderland incredible conspiracy. Larry, I was wondering if we could jump a little bit now and perhaps move on to E. Howard Hunt. Just let me set it up. E. Howard Hunt, if our younger listeners have ever heard of Watergate, he was one of the people that was involved with Watergate, which was in the Nixon era, and 72, 73, if I'm not mistaken. E. Howard Hunt was a CIA agent. He was involved with all kinds of things, including the Bay of Pigs. Just Google E. Howard Hunt for his complete itinerary. He was reputed to be one of the bad guys in the CIA, with possible connections to, of course, our subject matter, which is the JFK conspiracy. And maybe we can just continue from there, Larry, if you don't mind.
Sure, I can do that. And actually, this will end up bringing us through the back door to Ruby in a way, because where Hunt will take us is to Cuba and to the secret war against Castro and to the CIA's anti-Castro activities. Hunt's career in general, and he was a long-term, he actually started out his career working for the OSS in Southeast Asia before he joined the CIA. He was what's called a political action officer. And
around what era was that, Larry?
Oh, well,
late 40s, early 50s?
He made his transition into the CIA in the late 40s.
Okay, thanks.
So he's in the CIA in the 50s, the 60s, and served in positions in South America. He was in Mexico City. But his forte, I guess you would say, was he was the type of person who would make contacts with, let's just say, anti-government factions that the U.S. was supporting. And basically, he would go into, as the CIA would go into countries where there was a communist anti-government movement, if you will. And they were generally aiding the government, either aiding the government and opposing it, or if the communist government was in place, they would be aiding the other side. And Hunt's role was generally to serve as a contact person with these factions, make them comfortable, get to know their leaders, provide them money, give them support, and that's why the term political action officer comes up. He wasn't a he's often, and even as he describes himself as a spy, but he really was not a counterintelligence officer. He wasn't the sort of person that you'd find making midnight drops in Moscow. He's not that kind of a spy, and he certainly was not a paramilitary covert operations type. As a matter of fact, his spying skills were generally felt within peers within the agencies to not be all that good, really. There's a term for those sorts of things. It's called tradecraft, and Hunt's marks for tradecraft were generally low, which actually you see at the Watergate, where he got caught and actually got caught with enough paperwork and records so that they could trace back the whole operation. So I just say that to set the stage, is he's often thought of as a famous spy, and although he was a well-known CIA officer and did work on a lot of very important projects, it's important to know what his talents were when you really get to considering his possible role in a conspiracy.
He also has kind of a deathbed confession, although he was, in fact, very ill at the time he made the confession. Again, you can go on the internet and just Google E. Howard Hunt, and you'll be able to come up with a tape for that. For copyright reasons, I did not download it, but certainly it is available out there. Essentially, I'll paraphrase. He says that he was told by fellow CIA operatives that, in fact, it was Johnson that was in control. I should say up front, I've always felt that that was disinformation to throw us off the scent, perhaps, or maybe continue a cover-up that might be going on, perpetrating that cover-up. How do you feel about that, Larry?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to remember is that this is not exactly a deathbed confession. It's not that Howard Hunt had kept quiet on this whole subject up until, a few hours before his death, and suddenly made a tape recording as if he were confessing and, getting it off his chest.
That's true, and I was misleading in that, and I apologize for that. He was sick, and I think it was made 2 years before his death, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, but I guess that beyond that, Howard had made a practice of insinuating to various people that he knew about a conspiracy for years. In fact, if you go back to Watergate, Howard really made a practice of essentially claiming that he knew things that would be bad if they were revealed, and he did this to get, obviously, during Watergate, to get financial support. But I think there is one, I think it was Playboy article, where he had told a reporter that for $2 million he would tell anyone needed to know about the JFK conspiracy. He had kind of set himself up as having this knowledge, but we have to remember that something that I didn't describe as part of his background is Howard Hunt was an author. He authored a series of spy action novels.
That's right.
And he was good at telling action type stories and creating a lot of suspense, and actually he was admired within the agency because they thought that it was good to have people writing good, solid spy stories where the spies were the good guys. And I guess Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, at one point, certain people were kind of fond of Howard because they thought he was sort of a PR asset. In any event, so I set the stage to that. It's really not surprising to find Howard Hunt claiming to have inside information on the conspiracy. This was something that was bandied about long before the tape or long before his death. The David Gianmarco, who I think was scheduled to be on your show, did speak to us last year at last year's JFK Lancers Conference about this, and I think to report on a few of his remarks, Gianmarco had become acquainted with Howard Hunt and become fairly friendly with Howard Hunt. Hunt was a well-known figure because of Watergate and for a variety of reasons, and he and as he told us at the conference, he and Kevin Costner had actually talked to Hunt for a number of years about the possibility of, what did he really know and what would it take to get him to tell it. And they had engaged in a dialogue with him on this subject for years before that tape was made.
I should just interrupt and say that's Kevin Costner, the actor who played Jim Garrison in JFK, the movie JFK, and he also played Kenny O'Donnell in the movie 13 Days. He's a famous star. You know him from other movies as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Larry.
Oh, no, and obviously he is very much interested in the JFK assassination.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
they had an extended dialogue with Hunt about this, and a lot of give and take. What would it take? How much money would it take? How would you reveal it? So on and so forth. So again, there's a lot of history to this.
Mm-hmm.
So with just that as background, I guess I would say then that you'd ask me to evaluate the core story, and the core story that he apparently told and even sketched out a bit of a chart on was that is that the whole idea had really come from Johnson. It was Johnson's idea to kill Kennedy, and Johnson had gone to and essentially gotten the agreement of CIA officer Cord Meyer
Mm-hmm.
to run the operation. Cord Meyer was not really covert operations or paramilitary or assassinations. He was more a political type, as a matter of fact. But Cord Meyer was supposed to have recruited another senior CIA officer named William Harvey, who recruited David Morales, and these names
Mm-hmm.
really don't make sense to you until you've studied it. They're very familiar to us, and I think even
Yes.
at the time, these are names that have been floating around for decades. These are not new names. This is not really new information. All of them have been the subject of speculation before the Hunt revelation, as it were.
A long time.
One of the things that makes it kind of interesting, and I'll get that in a moment, Cord Meyer is known. His wife, who had separated from him, it is now known, did have an affair with JFK.
I was going to mention that after, actually. Yeah.
It kind of makes an interesting, and we'll get to why I think that's important, but the strange thing, of course, is if you start evaluating these people, you have to see what sense it makes. And is Cord Meyer the type of person who has experience with assassinations or, anything of that nature? And the answer is no, he isn't. If you were going through resumes, he would just not. He might be motivated, I suppose, because of his wife's relationship, but he doesn't have the professional ability. William Harvey doesn't. The next person down the line that Hunt mentions, David Morales, most definitely does.
Mm-hmm. Big time.
And if you wanted to go pick a man to put together the JFK conspiracy, it would be David Morales.
Mm-hmm.
So that name makes a great deal of sense. What starts not to make sense is that, according to Hunt, then David Morales recruited Frank Sturgis, who, of course, later shows up at the Watergate with Howard Hunt. And Frank Sturgis calls up Hunt and says, why don't you come down to Miami? We'd like to meet with you about something. Hunt goes down. They meet in a motel room, and David Morales says, well, we're going to kill the president. Would you like to join in? And Hunt says, no, I don't think so. And so they proceed to tell him the rest of the story. Supposedly in this meeting, the motel room, they say, well, Johnson's behind this, and he got Cord Meyer and William Harvey, and we're going to use a Corsican shooter to actually kill JFK. It's sort of like Hunt has declined to participate, so now they're going to fill him in on the details.
Mm-hmm. It's like, geez, no, sorry, I can't, but you want to go for a beer anyways.
It's too bad you don't want to do this.
Crazy.
Because it's really a great lineup, and so
good
Hunt
lineup. That's really good, Larry. I like that.
Hunt just, kind of says, well, great, but, Harvey's drunk, and I don't really, I just don't really want to get into this, so I'll just sit on the sidelines, and just kind of waltzes off. And that, you step back from that and you say, David Morales, and if you research and you know David Morales and know how effective he is, and yes, indeed, he did kill lots of people, and you just kind of then say, well, they invited Howard Hunt to join in. We don't know why, but he declines, and then they tell him the whole plot, and he just walks away. Is that likely? And my personal view is that does not seem likely to me, knowing what I know of David Morales.
Yeah.
It's sort of like if David offers you something, you either go on board or you're underwater. Don't come back up again.
You're swimming with the fishes, as they say.
Yeah, yes, indeed. He doesn't leave loose ends around like that. And this is important. I don't want to make light out of it because, as you know from my book, I view David Morales as indeed a major operator in the plot. And indeed, David Morales had expressed remarks to that effect to his closest longtime personal friend, not too long before Morales died. So Morales is a person to be taken very seriously.
Very much so.
The chain that Hunt lays out and the circumstances he lays out don't strike me as making a whole lot of sense. Is the fact that David Morales would recruit Frank Sturgis. Frank Sturgis was not, he was a CIA informant. He was quite well known, but in 1963 he was an informant. He was reporting to a CIA case officer named Bernard Barker, who's also involved in Watergate. But I know from a memo I've read that Morales tried to get Barker fired because he thought Barker and everybody who was associated with him talked too much. So it seems unlikely then to me that Morales would pick Frank Sturgis to join in. And then it would be like, well, again, these people killed the President of the United States. Now, is it likely that we're going to see them again at Watergate? And wouldn't they kind of keep a lower profile than this? You
would think.
So I don't want this is a serious subject, and I don't want to be too lighthearted about it. But it seems to me that the scenario laid out in this revelation just does not make a lot of sense to me personally. And I will say that when Gianmarco was talking to us, he expressed the fact that in the end they got to feeling that what Hunt was really interested in doing was working all this into a book, which would make a lot of sense, and it would make a great book of the sorts of books that Hunt used to write and sell in good quantities. And bringing in Cord Meyer would certainly add that extra effect to it of he's going to kill JFK because his wife is having an affair with him. It sounds more like a book to me than anything else.
Or a movie of the week or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we are talking with renowned JFK researcher Larry Hancock. And Larry has a terrific book out. It's called Someone Would Have Talked, and you can get it at the JFK Lancer website, and I'll spell that for you. It's www.jfklancer, LANCER.com. I should also say where the name Lancer comes from, I've said this a few times now, is that was the code name given to JFK by the Secret Service. His wife's code name was Lace, Jacqueline Kennedy, the First Lady. We are discussing many topics tonight. We're discussing how things are starting to make sense now, Larry, because you're introducing all these players, but you're doing it so concisely and precisely that we're getting a very, very good overview of how all these players are starting to connect, how they don't connect, and where it's leading towards the cumulation of the assassination. I was wondering if we could go in and talk about David Morales now, because we've just been talking about him just in the context of E. Howard Hunt. I was wondering if we can go into more detail about him.
Sure. Background on David Morales. David Morales was very much a different type of CIA officer than E. Howard Hunt. Morales got his start in Berlin, in the CIA in Berlin. He had been in the Army. We don't know exactly for what purpose he was recruited in to the CIA, but his specialty came to be operations, paramilitary operations. His first major operation was Guatemala, when he was part of a team along with Hunt and David Phillips, a name that's come up in conjunction with the assassination, and Henry Heckscher. This whole group of people that essentially really did orchestrate the overthrow of what the U.S. considered to be a communist government. And Morales, it's clear, was in charge of paramilitary operations. It looks like that he helped do some training and actually was involved in a plan that would have brought in people from another country that would have been used to actually, well, I wouldn't call it a death squad, but let's just say that they had a list, a blacklist of known communists within that government, and the point was to be that after the revolution, those people simply would not have been around, and that cadre and that network would have been neutralized and eliminated, whatever you want to call it. I bring that up because we'll come into that again later. Morales was described, I guess the best description that I've read by David Phillips, who was a senior CIA officer, as being the best back alley operator that he had ever known. And what that really meant was that David Morales knew how to get people killed. And Morales certainly talked to his friends and is on record about having killed people himself in the line of duty, including later on a major general in South America. He was a fearsome type person. There's no doubt about it. Everyone that came in contact with him related the fact that the man had no sense of humor. He was insanely anti-communist, patriotic. His lawyer talks about the fact that they would get into not really arguments, but Morales was fanatically opposed to John Kennedy because Morales had trained a number of the people that were to be sent into Cuba at the time of the Bay of Pigs, and a lot of those people got killed, and he blamed it entirely on John Kennedy and felt him to be a traitor, and his lawyer describes how strongly he felt about it. He said one time Morales walked into his office, sat down, and he looked over, and the lawyer had actually campaigned for John Kennedy and had a little ceramic ashtray or something on his desk about the Kennedy campaign, and Morales just matter-of-factly said, "Would you like to put that away, or do you want me to break it into pieces right now?" Unbelievable.
What a temper on this guy, and the attitude.
Yeah, he was definitely related as if having serious temper problems, and actually some recent dialogues with his family members reinforce that, and I think it's fascinating. I've read an article recently that states that his wife and some of his children were interviewed and were actually cited as saying that the mother had cautioned the children that at some point in time they needed to be prepared to the fact that their father might be linked to the Kennedy assassination, and she didn't want that to shock them.
Whoa, that's serious revelation.
Yeah,
holy cow.
Yeah, I think Shane O'Sullivan did that interview in the last year or so, and it was in a video that he produced. But again, his lawyer, his best friend, longtime friend, had been on record as with those same sort of comments and talking about and Morales had a bad temper. He also had a bit of drinking problem, and there was one one night when they were sitting together, and he'd been drinking a lot, and somebody said something about Kennedy. I think the lawyer did again, and he just got up, and after about a 15-minute tirade, he just sat back down on the bed in the motel room and said, "But that's okay, we took care of that SOB." Which obviously is circumstantial and anecdotal, but his friend and the lawyer just sort of felt that it was pretty real life.
Well, coming from that character, as you said before, you have to examine things, put them in context, and then do a character analysis. And is this plausible from this character? And I think in this case, it would be a resounding yes.
Not only could have, but certainly it would have been in character. And again, my personal thing is when somebody who is credible says something like that, somebody who has apparently not much of a sense of humor, I just don't see any reason not to take them seriously.
Do you feel he put the whole thing together or parts of it? Do you feel he was right there involved in the shooting? How do you see his role?
I don't know that we will ever know enough. I think one of the things that we do know is that he had a team of very devoted Cuban exiles. These were people that he had trained to go into Cuba. And actually this was, when we first started getting into this, we didn't know any of this. For example, the House Select Committee, which we've mentioned before, the congressional investigators, one of their investigators, Gaten Fonzie, came across Morales and heard some rumors and gossip that would have connected him to the conspiracy. Well, Fonzie went to the CIA and tried to come up with some background, and at that point in time, the CIA would not even acknowledge that he existed.
Really?
Which is a very strange thing.
Yeah.
Because David Morales was chief of operations at the CIA's base in Miami. He was essentially second in command of the whole CIA war against Castro.
Wave.
This is not a person who's a minor person. Later on, he became a consultant to the Joint Chiefs. He held the GS rank of equivalent of general. And the CIA would not even acknowledge to a congressional investigator that he existed.
Whoa. So that's almost validation that this is some evil guy right away.
This is not somebody that the CIA would want you, really. It's kind of like, we are not sure of everything that he did ourselves, and we don't want you to find out something we don't know.
Holy cow.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Folks, we're speaking with the renowned JFK researcher Larry Hancock. He's got a terrific book out. All the stories he's relaying to us tonight can be found in his book called Someone Would Have Talked. And you can pick up that book along with other books on this subject, on the JFK assassination, at www.jfklancer.com, LANCER.com. Sign up for their newsletter when you get there, because it's an incredible resource, their newsletter. It'll put you in touch with other researchers. There's a forum there you can go to for even more information. It's all indexed. You can also go to the Mary Farrell Foundation. Just do a Google on Mary Farrell Foundation. We're talking with Larry Hancock. We're making connections tonight, which is really interesting, how one person relates to the other and relates to the other, and you're going to see how it's all going to come back around to where we started tonight with Jack Ruby. I was wondering if we can go into the anti-Castro Cubans and JM Wave in Miami.
Right, and that's where we really start to make the connection.
Yeah.
The point is that Morales was a fervent anti-communist. I mean, that was part of his job, but that was also part of him. Mm-hmm. And so he was, after Guatemala, he was brought into the Cuba project. He actually worked counterintelligence and prepared exile teams to go into Cuba. It's a matter of speculation. A lot of the documents seem to suggest that there was a blacklist for Cuba as well, that Cuban communist cadre lists were made, and that the plan was that once the Bay of Pigs succeeded, that this cadre, if you will call it that, would make sure that the dedicated communists within the Castro government didn't survive to participate in the next Cuban government.
Mm-hmm.
And Morales was connected to those people. Afterwards, after the Bay of Pigs failed, he stayed in the CIA project run out of Miami, the Jamway project,
mm-hmm.
and he became the operations manager, which meant that his people staged all of the missions into Cuba, the penetration, the sabotage missions. He also maintained contact with this Cuban counterintelligence network that I'm talking about, and it would appear that he also had a selected handful of people that he very much trusted that weren't necessarily on the CIA payroll that were involved in anti-Castro efforts, and if something needed to be done that might be just a bit irregular, he had people outside the system that he could turn to.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really at a nexus of very violent people, very fanatically anti-Castro people, and
incredibly fanatical.
What we see is that in 1963, one of the things that begins to happen is that John Kennedy actually began what's called a back channel approach to Fidel Castro.
That's right, yes.
And the CIA was aware of this. We actually know that David Morales was aware of this. And the speculation is that this essentially drove whoever is associated with him, drove certain number of the Cuban exiles ballistic. It's sort of the scenario as well. If Kennedy remains in office and Kennedy gets what he wants, he's going to do a settlement with Castro, and you people are never going home.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know of any story, and we have sources that say that sort of information was being circulated among select exiles. So when you ask me about what his role would be, would Morales have been capable of coming up with a tactical plan for Dallas? Certainly would have. Mm-hmm. Would he have known the people that had the paramilitary skills, the shooting skills? Certainly he would have. Because he was also involved in supporting one other activity, and that was the Castro assassination attempts.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that after.
And now we know that there were actually a series of Castro assassination attempts, both before the Bay of Pigs and after the Bay of Pigs. And
Larry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I guess I should have done this before, but for those of you too young to know what we're talking about with the Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs, essentially the Reader's Digest version in about a minute, was, you all know who Castro is, I'm sure. Castro is in charge of Cuba. He has been since 1959. There was a revolution. The revolution was led by Castro and essentially took over a corrupt pro-Western government. There was a lot of people that left Cuba because of the revolution, because Castro ended up going towards the communist side. When they left Cuba, a lot of the Cubans, they went to Florida. And they're still there now. Remember a few years ago there was that Gonzales case where the little fellow was going to be returned to his father in Cuba. And the federal marshals, when they went to get the little guy to return him to his father in Cuba, showed up with machine guns and everything else, and everybody couldn't figure out why. It's because they're very fanatically anti-Castro. All that to say, there was 1,500 people that were put together in an army force that were planning to go in, take over Cuba again from Castro in 1960, I believe it was. And this was called the Bay of Pigs because they were going to land at the Bay of Pigs, which is a little spot in Cuba. They were going to create a beachhead there with these 1,500 people, paramilitary guys, and try and take over the country. Now, they were hoping that the U.S. would back them with military support. In fact, the military didn't, and consequently what happened were these 1,500 people were taken prisoner, many of them were killed, many of them were put in prison, and then released afterwards. That, in a nutshell, for better or for worse, is the Bay of Pigs. So at least there's something there you can understand when we mention the Bay of Pigs, folks, that you can kind of have a bit of a base for. Back to Larry. Thank goodness for Larry.
Well, and just tack one thing onto that. Among
do.
the CIA officers that were participating, it appears, and this is interesting because there's been some good information come available on this recently. It appears that the officers that were embedded with the Cubans anticipated, were led to believe that there would be active Air Force and military support. There was actually a naval task force standing offshore. And so they really expected that this was going to be committed. However, the high-level military officers, shortly before the operation commenced, went to their CIA management and said, "You realize this is not going to work unless." And they were told, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." But the commitment had never been gotten from the president to commit the U.S. publicly to the effort. And it really is, it's a very strange matter, but the two things come into play here. First of all, we now know that those senior CIA officers suspected or anticipated that Castro would indeed be assassinated immediately prior, because there was a project to do that. And so they felt with Castro dead, the plan would succeed, because the plan as you described it is almost insane.
Absolutely.
If you think about it, it's not insane with Castro dead. But what that resulted in was a whole set of Cuban exiles and U.S. military officers and CIA officers who literally convinced themselves or were convinced that JFK had abandoned them, had intentionally abandoned those people, and they, again, as I said, just as Morales said, considered him a traitor who had gotten their friends killed. And the level of animosity was so great it just can hardly be imagined.
And that, in fact, is a crucial part of the story, which I had omitted. Just wanted to give them a quick overview of it. But really, you're bringing the whole thing really into focus and giving a motive for anti-Castro Cuban.
It was really a three-strike thing, I'd say, Brent. First,
go
you
ahead,
had
please.
Bay of Pigs. Then the missile crisis occurred.
That's right.
And the Cubans were convinced, of course, that the U.S. would intervene in, here is Castro setting up atomic missiles aimed at the U.S. Of course, the U.S. is going to invade. But no, what does Kennedy do? He reaches a compromise, and Castro's still in power. And then a year later, they're told that he is negotiating a deal that will end the embargo and would reestablish relations. So at that point in time, you've pretty much got three strikes against him.
Very much so. For those of you that want some background on the Cuban Missile Crisis, do yourself a favor and go and rent 13 Days with Kevin Costner in it. And we'll let it go at that.
It's hard to wrap all of this up.
Holy
There's so
cow.
much history that we're dealing with. It's not just Dallas. But to get back to your essential question about David Morales, the thing that we had not discussed, and the thing that does begin to connect it together, is he had supported logistically and was connected to the people that were trying to kill Castro, the Castro assassination projects, and he was acquainted with them. And one of the tracks in the Castro assassination project was to use some of the former gamblers and casino people who had been booted out of Cuba and really resented it, and to use their assets within Cuba and to essentially use that to set up poison attempts and shooting attempts against Castro, where the CIA did not have the assets in the field to do it, and besides, the CIA wanted to be able to deny it. So one of the things that came into play was the CIA really allied itself with certain mafia types, and the key contact in that connection was John Roselli.
Bingo.
Which eventually brings you back to Jack Ruby, and there's a purported document that actually showed meetings between Roselli and Ruby in the fall of 1963. And I wish we could get our hands on it. The interesting thing is, I know some people who've done a great deal of work with all the FBI surveillance documents on John Roselli, and the FBI had him under surveillance for about 7 years, very tight surveillance. The interesting thing is, out of all the files that we can find, voluminous files from Los Angeles and Las Vegas, the only set of files that are missing have to do with Miami, which is where the meeting purportedly occurred.
Coincidence? I don't think so.
But it is the people that I talked about earlier, the people that the link to Jack Ruby could very well go back to John Roselli. Ruby had been very much interested. As I said, he had a friend who worked in a Cuban casino. He contacted that friend in 1963. For some reason, they got back together. The friend was working in Vegas then. Ruby had very much wanted to become involved in the Havana scene, and even after Castro took over, Ruby had made contact with one of the arms dealers that had been supplying Castro during the revolution, trying to get an introduction. And he had a number of connections to Cuban affairs, and actually had even been had been used by the FBI as an informant during the period of the Castro Revolution. It's all very fascinating, but again, when you start connecting the dots, Jack Ruby is no more isolated than Lee Oswald is.
Exactly.
Although the official story would like you to view them that way.
Exactly, yes. I should also say, too, just for clarification of what was going on in Cuba in 1959, watch The Godfather movie Part 2. As I make recommendations to watch movies, it's based on what was happening in Cuba. Basically, there was a pile of casinos that were being run from the American Mafia in Cuba prior to Castro taking over. When Castro took over, he closed them all down and kicked the mob out of Cuba. So, of course, you're going to have a pissed-off mafia big time. And combined with all these pissed-off exiles from Cuba living in Miami, and John Roselli gets into the mix and everything, and he's dealing with these anti-Castro Cubans, well, it's fire. And then you throw the CIA into it, and away you go. Larry, I have to tell you, you're making something that's very, very complex crystal clear tonight. It's probably the clearest I've ever been on this whole subject, and I have to give you kudos for it. You're doing an incredible job with all these names and subjects, connecting the dots, as you say, and we've come right back around in a circle, right to Jack Ruby where we started.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Folks, we are talking with Larry Hancock, and as you can tell, he's an incredible JFK researcher. He has an amazing book. All this is laid out in his book. It is called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals with who knew about the assassination before the assassination. It can be gotten at the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com. Also, when you're there, do yourself a favor, sign up for their newsletter, join their forum. It is a wealth of information. You'll be able to converse probably with Larry himself. I'm sure Larry goes on the forum from time to time. They also have a conference that takes place every year in Dallas to commemorate the assassination, and they invite major researchers with new research to come and give little lectures during the conference. This year, the conference takes place between the 21st and 23rd of November in Dallas. They also have little tours that will take you around to the sites where, unfortunately, where JFK was assassinated, the Grassy Knoll, the Texas School Book Depository, etc., etc. It really is a worthwhile trip for you to make. And living history, as Sherry Feaster said last week, you're able to talk with witnesses who were right there in Dealey Plaza that day and speak with them one-on-one. It is really worthwhile going. That's jfklancer.com. Larry, I'm going to ask you to speculate right now. I'm going to ask you to walk us through your version of the assassination.
Sure. We'll do it. So we were sort of at the starting point, and
yes,
the starting point is certainly very nebulous to me. I wish I had a firm view of the starting point. About the firmest view that I could have is that there were a group of people that were working together, who had been working together in the Castro assassination efforts and in the Cuban exile community. These people all shared a common antipathy towards President Kennedy for several different reasons. We've talked about David Morales. Johnny Roselli was under extreme pressure from the FBI, from Robert Kennedy, and as well as were another number of senior Mafia folks, and certainly they had a vested interest in seeing John Kennedy go away, which would mean Bobby Kennedy would go away. So these people had a lot of common interest, and in my view, it could have been as simple as them getting together and talking about how bad the situation was and what could be done about it, or it could have been suggested to them. There could have been a suggestion coming from a higher level within the CIA, literally to Morales, saying, "Do you realize what Kennedy is really going to end up doing? Do you realize? Something has to be done about this." And we've learned that a lot of things, unfortunately, happen within the agency that way. A senior officer would simply sit down, have a chat with one of the people that reported to him, talk about how things were bad, how they'd be done, and no orders were ever given. No instructions were ever given. This is the basis of plausible deniability. Afterwards, the person would say, "Well, no, I wasn't ordered to do anything, and I certainly didn't know if it was approved, but but we went and did it because it was necessary." So that's what makes it so nebulous as to how high it could have started and what was behind it. But I think as far as Dallas itself, one of the things that becomes pretty clear is there's a timeline for Dallas. There is certainly a point in time in which it is known that the Texas trip is going to be made and Dallas is on the agenda. There is obviously a point in time when it's decided that Lee Oswald is going to be involved, and that the plot itself is defined to use Oswald to focus attention on Castro. And one of the things that lets us date that is that we know that there was a given point in time when Lee Oswald goes back to Dallas, is going to reside in Dallas, is going to be located there. The plot against the president could not have been set for Dallas the way it was set without Lee Oswald in residence. So we do have some things that allow us to essentially create a timeline for it. We haven't talked about Lee Oswald a lot. We haven't talked about Oswald and what happened in Mexico City shortly before the assassination, and that's a whole dialogue to itself. But let's just say, to set the timeline, and I know you had Mr. Bolden on earlier this evening, my personal view of the assassination is that things began to gel for Dallas starting in probably September of 1963. I don't see a very long-term conspiracy. I see people, and talk in the book about people that were interested in killing JFK and may have stalked JFK and may have tried and come up with different plots. But when I'm talking about the plot that killed him, I define it as the Dallas plot.
Okay.
So to answer your question, I'm talking specifically about Dallas, and I see that decision being made in the September time frame once Lee Oswald returns from Mexico City, takes up residence in Dallas, and that brings Oswald there. Oswald has been closely associated with being a Castro supporter. Oswald is on record as having been in contact with both the Cubans and the Soviets in Mexico City. And as a matter of fact, more than that, Oswald is on record of having talked with and met the Soviet KGB officer who is in charge of assassinations and sabotage for North America.
Very good point. Very good research on your part, too, to bring that out.
So at that point in time, if I'm putting together a plot, all I pretty much have to do is make sure that Lee Oswald turns up as the man associated with the gun, and what are the newspaper headlines going to say?
Communist kills Kennedy, and off they go.
I have a copy of a San Antonio paper whose headline, which covers half the page, the next day says, Castro supporter kills president.
There you go.
And so the people putting together the plot had that, and that was the piece they wanted, because the plot, and as we talked about last time, this isn't really my version of plot. This is the plot as was related by John Martino, who we talked about in the last conversation.
Yes.
The plot is literally to kill the president, point the finger at Lee Oswald, and frame Lee Oswald in a fashion that makes it obvious that the communist and Castro were behind it, and trigger a reaction, not only to kill the president, that was only part of the plot, and to trigger an attack on Cuba, retaliation against Cuba. Okay, how did this come together then? Obviously, as I said, David Morales had the assets. He had the people. He had people who had been trained to penetrate Cuba and assassinate Fidel Castro. For those people, penetrating Dallas, Texas, was no challenge at all.
None at all. That's true too.
They had trained. They'd been inserted. They'd operated in enemy territory to operate, covertly. We actually have an individual who is very much involved in these anti-Castro efforts, who is on record of having said, I think this is fascinating, having commented that the plot, tactically, to kill the president in Dallas was very similar to a plot that they'd put together to kill Fidel Castro in South America.
Was that I can't pronounce his last name.
Viciana.
Thank you very much.
Antonio Viciana.
Yes.
And the elements of that plot there were several elements. It was to involve concealed weapons. It was to involve people that were infiltrated into a public appearance of Castro. That was the first. And in that case, there were actually 3 different plots. One was to kill him in public during a public appearance. If that didn't work, they were going to ambush him on a highway by blocking his motorcade and using snipers to kill him. And if that didn't work, they were going to essentially blow up his plane at the airport by crashing a plane into it.
Whoa.
So it was a tiered program, and as part of this, they were going to blame the whole thing on the communists. And they'd prepared false documents. They had even gone to the trouble of setting up a patsy and preparing all sorts of information that would show that as I recall, that the Soviets were behind it. But the point of this is that these people did have very sophisticated tactics. These are not just people that would grab up a rifle and go try to accomplish something, because their primary target they had been training for was the head of a communist government in an extremely militarized and security-conscious country. And so any effort, any skill set like that directed against the Secret Service and the Dallas police, it really wasn't much of a contest.
I understand that. You just alluded to the capabilities do you feel that the capabilities to put all this in play in terms of the documents, the patsy, setting Oswald up as the patsy, and everything that's interweaved together, do you feel that would be the capabilities of someone like David Morales?
Oh, absolutely.
Would he draw upon the CIA for some of that?
Well, I mean, David Morales is a senior CIA officer.
Mm-hmm.
He's been doing, by this time, he's been doing covert operations for over a decade. Could he draw? The interesting thing about it is that here's a man who has been involved in supporting assassination projects. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the system itself creates things for these projects in a totally compartmentalized fashion. No one gets an explanation of why a certain travel arrangements are being made or a certain document is made, or, you know, nobody asks these questions. And so to answer your question, could he have used black CIA monies? Could he have used assets that were there for some other purpose? Or could they have made use of some of the gambling network crime assets? These people know how to make false documents too.
Hoffa.
Right.
You know?
So
Yeah.
when you take a combination of Morales and Roselli, you know, these people have all sorts of assets available to them, and nobody is going to ask questions. And then I speculate that after the fact, another number of people looked up and said, I wonder if, you know, and suddenly realized that if there was really a serious investigation, suddenly they were accessories. Had they known what was going on? No. But could they have been accessories anyway? Certainly. And I have no reason to doubt that a number of people decided very quickly that they weren't going to talk about anything because it was in their self-interest not to talk about anything. Did that answer your
Very
question?
very much so. It's making a lot of sense, actually, what you're talking about.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
It's just phenomenal to think that people could be so pissed off and want to have a war so badly as to assassinate the President of the United States. It just blows my mind away. Listening to Mr. Bolden this afternoon, what this man had gone through in prison, what he was subjected to was inhuman. And yet he stood the tide. And I have to give all the researchers that have been involved in the JFK assassination, whether you agree with them or not, very clearly, there's no money involved in any of this, folks. They just do it out of patriotism and the love of freedom. We are speaking with Larry Hancock tonight, renowned JFK researcher. Got a terrific book. If you've enjoyed all the stories he's been telling tonight, they're all true. They can all be found in his book, Someone Would Have Talked, which of course is available at www.jfklancer.com, and do sign up for their newsletter when you're there. Larry, is there anything? We have about 15 minutes left. I can't believe it's 11:45. I can't believe it. I just looked up at the clock and I figured, okay, maybe around 10 after 11 at the latest, and it's 11:45. Is there anything you would like to talk to people about in the next 10 minutes? Something that's...
Well, I think to continue on in a bit of the same vein,
yes, sir?
And one of the things that keeps us from knowing, and because you were asking me to speculate, what we don't know, we know what happened to Dallas. We don't know exactly what was supposed to happen. John Martino tells us that the plot, as far as the plotters were concerned, was totally blown when Oswald was captured and when the policeman was killed and when he was taken into custody. He tells us that the plan had been for Oswald to meet a contact in the school book depository, to be taken out of Dallas, and obviously eliminated in a fashion that would have pointed even more strongly at Castro. We don't know what documents they had prepared to be planted with Oswald. We don't know what people were prepared to name Oswald as a Castro agent. So we don't see the second half of the plot. We see the president killed, and so we tend to think of the assassination, strictly in terms of shooting the president. We don't tend to think of the assassination in terms of a broader plot. Certainly, according to Martino, there was a much broader plot, and it didn't work. But that's what makes it so difficult to speculate, because we can only see what did happen, and we don't see that other part.
And we talked about this the other night in our pre-production meeting, how we both felt that Jack Ruby was in fact kind of a panic mode, because they had to get rid of Oswald so he wouldn't reveal what he knew. And they brought Jack Ruby in. I mean, to bring somebody in front of 70 police officers to kill someone, you've got to be pretty desperate to try and accomplish something like that.
Well, and I think that also gives you a good insight in the fact that tactically, whoever put it together brought assets into Dallas to do the shooting, do the actual act, and to frame Oswald, but they weren't based in Dallas. They wouldn't have had to turn to, and certainly, again, we talked about resumes earlier. Jack Ruby was not a killer. He was a tough guy. He beat people up, and he was certainly violent, but you wouldn't have picked Jack Ruby.
No, he wasn't a known assassin.
And you certainly wouldn't have picked Jack Ruby with all of his obvious ties back into the crime networks that the Warren Commission had to work so hard at ignoring. You would not have picked Jack unless you didn't really know anybody else around that you could just call up and say, do it. That certainly recommends an aspect of desperation. I would throw in a couple of anecdotal stories that
please
that go along with that. We do have an interview with the law partner of Melvin Belli, who of course ended up defending Ruby in court. And Ruby's law partner said that he received a call right after Oswald's murder, and the call came from Las Vegas, and the call was from someone whose voice he recognized, someone he had, quote-unquote, known from Havana, and that person was calling to say that one of their guys had just killed that SOB Oswald, and they really needed to defend him, but it needed to be set up in such a fashion so that the money was not obviously coming from them. And this takes us into a protracted question of why was Ruby's defense the way it was. But the point is that would give you one indication that the former Havana people, whether that be Roselli himself or some of his friends who had been in Havana, were the ones who kicked off the defense for Ruby. And Roselli himself is quoted as telling Jack Anderson that, quote-unquote, Ruby was their guy in Dallas.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
So the circle does come pretty well together.
Here's a speculation question. It's kind of, I'm just pulling it out of my head. Why wouldn't Bobby go after them? Bobby Kennedy, I'm talking about, folks, who was the Attorney General. Was he just too overcome? Was he paranoid? Any speculation on that one?
There's been a lot written about that recently, and we do know a couple of things. We do know that Bobby Kennedy did two things. He actively helped suppress investigation of conspiracy during the first months. There's just no doubt about that. The people in Mexico City, the State Department people, the CIA people down there, had so much evidence tying Oswald to the Cubans that they were convinced, as they were supposed to be, because that was the plot, that he was being operated by Cuban intelligence or incited by Cuban intelligence, and they wanted that investigated. And both Johnson and Bobby Kennedy apparently cooperated in essentially telling them that there was to be no investigation. So apparently he did cooperate that, and he certainly supported the Warren Commission publicly.
Yes,
supported
yeah.
the Warren Commission statement. I
Even
think
though off the record he disagreed with it.
That's true, and even though one of his first acts that afternoon, when supposedly he was in a terrible mental state,
Yeah, that's right.
was to call one of the Cuban exiles and essentially say, "Your people did it."
Mm-hmm. I thought you were going to relay the John McCone incident also. Go ahead.
Yeah, now, the reason I focus in on that is that there's every reason to think that Bobby early on suspected that it had to be the Cuban exiles or the mob, that this was the conspiracy. There are people that have offered some evidence to show that the name Lee Oswald might not have been totally unknown to Bobby, that he would have had reason to associate Lee Oswald with Cuban events. But the problem you get into there, two problems. First of all, as Lamar Waldron has speculated, it appears that there was a high-risk operation in effect at the time where both the Kennedy brothers thought there might be a coup launched in Cuba. And Waldron speculates that Bobby didn't want to essentially blow that chance, and so he didn't talk for a while.
Do you feel that's credible? I like Lamar Waldron's book. I really do. I use it a lot because there's so much information in it. Things that I didn't know about, like the two shooters behind the Grassy Knoll, for example. But I'm going to leave it up to you to speculate.
Lamar and I cheerfully disagree about many things.
Okay, fair enough.
We talk a lot, and so we have an agreement to, disagree in good humor. I absolutely think, in all honesty, I think he has uncovered a major historical event in the fact that I do think his coup plot that he described is correct. I think that it's entirely in line with the Kennedy multiple channel approach, dual track approach, high risk, high reward. I think that may well have been something that they were working on. Do I think that would have led to the cover-up or to the plot itself? No.
Okay.
And I've told Lamar that. I think there's a core to his book and his work that's very important. I look at the conspiracy itself differently.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
But I think one of the things that Bobby faced was that, what could he do immediately? What good would it have done? Is he going to... He's not the president, what can he really do? Could he launch an investigation of his own? Pragmatically, what could he do? We've even heard rumors, there are rumors that have circulated from the Kennedy staff for years that there was some discussion of he and his aides of arresting Johnson when he showed back up in D.C.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
Now, that's rumor and gossip, and I don't think even if the discussion had occurred that any of them would step up and say that.
Wow, I've never heard that before.
Yeah. But did you have to look at what his power was?
Yeah.
Yes, he was the Attorney General. He was not the President, and he absolutely knew that any suggestion he would ever make to the President, Johnson, would be absolutely the wrong thing, that Johnson would never agree with anything he wanted. And the other thing he knew was that by that time, Johnson was already starting to cover up. Now, so what's Bobby going to do? Bobby did know, absolutely, about some of these projects that were going on against Cuba. Would he want all of that to surface?
Obviously not.
As an epitaph to his brother? No. I think the real quick answer to your question is I see Bobby as highly conflicted and literally going from hour to hour, day to day, not knowing exactly what to do. I think eventually he did conclude that he'd been had, that he should have taken some action, but in those first hours, is Bobby Kennedy, if Bobby Kennedy thinks the Cubans are, is he going to start a war? Nobody wanted a war.
Not only that, he was traumatized. His brother was just murdered.
I think we have to accept the fact that he could have acted. He didn't act. I don't see anything terribly suspicious in his not acting.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that is quite fascinating, though, about that is he actually collected, it's pretty clear now that he collected a lot of the primary medical evidence, and that the president's personal physician, Dr. Berkeley,
That's right, yes.
collected that evidence, brought it to Bobby. You know, whether or not Bobby was having some afterthoughts about possibly reopening an investigation and having control of that evidence becomes pretty interesting. It becomes especially interesting when we know that Admiral Berkeley himself approached the Congressional Committee and offered to provide testimony of a conspiracy.
We're going to have to leave it on that because it's almost midnight.
It's a little bit of a teaser, yes.
But you're coming back, my friend. I'm sorry. And I do want to thank you so much for stepping in tonight. It really has been spectacular. Tonight, folks, we have been speaking with Larry Hancock, renowned JFK researcher, and he's got a great book out called Someone Would Have Talked. You can get it at the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com. Thank you again, Larry, and have a great evening, my friend.
You bet. Thank you, sir. Good night.
Thank you. Well, see you all next week, and thank you so much for listening to these shows. Thank you.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesday nights from 10 to midnight on CKLU 96.7 FM. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.